"Sir." The corporal's voice was steady, low, almost too calm. "This is Texas. We don't chain women." It was 1944, deep in Texas. The train screeched to a halt under a white, blinding sun. Heat shimmered off the steel cars as soldiers stepped down, rifles glinting. From the last carriage came silence, then the metallic rattle of chains. A dozen German women, auxiliary staff prisoners of war, stepped into the dust. Their uniforms were grey and torn, their faces pale from the Atlantic crossing. Around their wrists, iron shackles caught the light. Among them walked Helga Voss, a military nurse from Bremen, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. She had seen cities burn, men die, and nations fall. But nothing felt as heavy as those chains in the Texas heat. A young American guard named Caleb Stone watched from the side of the platform. He wasn't a soldier by nature. He'd been a ranch hand before the war, drafted after Pearl Harbor. The sight before him didn't sit right. These weren't spies or killers. They were women, exhausted, sunburned, and scared. The officer in charge barked orders. "Keep the restraints on until processing is complete." The guards nodded, but Stone didn't move. His hand hovered near his belt buckle, his jaw tightening. Helga stumbled as she stepped down, the chains between her wrists clinking softly. Stone took a step forward, ignoring the stares of his fellow guards. Without a word, he removed his gloves and knelt. The metal cuffs were burning hot to the touch. He took the key from the sergeant's belt, pressed it into the lock, and twisted. The click was almost inaudible, but it was the loudest sound in the world. The camp went silent. The officer spun around, shouting, "What do you think you're doing, Corporal?" Stone stood up slowly, the cuffs dangling in his hand. His voice was steady, low, almost too calm. "Sir," he said, "this is Texas. We don't chain women." For a long, dangerous second, no one spoke. The wind carried the smell of dust and mesquite across the siding. The other guards shifted, unsure. One lowered his rifle, then another. Finally, even the officer, after a long moment, nodded once, almost a salute, and turned away. Helga looked at her wrists. Thin white bands marked where iron had pressed her skin. She didn't speak English, but she understood the gesture. Her eyes met Stone's for a single second, enough to see that this man didn't act from pity or rebellion. He acted from principle. The rest of the women were freed one by one. The guards moved slowly now, deliberate, respectful. The chains fell into the dirt like broken promises. When it was over, Stone turned to walk back to his post. The officer muttered something under his breath, but the moment had already passed. The camp had seen what needed to be seen. Helga flexed her hands, feeling the air move between her fingers. For the first time since capture, she felt human again. That night, she wrote in her journal, "He did not look like a soldier. He looked like a man who remembered what decency is." And by morning, the story of the cowboy who unchained the prisoners was already spreading through the camp. A whisper, then a rumor, then a legend. It would travel farther than any of them knew. Before capture, Helga Voss had been told exactly what to expect if she ever fell into American hands. Cruelty, humiliation, and death. Propaganda had painted the Americans as savages in uniform, slaves to industry, incapable of honor. Every soldier and nurse heard the same refrain, "Better to die for Germany than be taken by the Yankees." On the Atlantic voyage to captivity, those lies became her armor. She sat in the corner of a crowded transport ship, hands wrapped around her knees, listening to the whispers. They say Americans shoot prisoners. They say they work them to death in the desert. They'll shave our heads, brand us like cattle. Helga didn't answer. She stared at the floor and thought of her mother's face when she last saw her. Hollow cheeks, city ruins behind her. She had promised to survive no matter what. But as the coastline of America rose in the distance, her stomach turned to stone. The first shock came before she even stepped off the ship. An American officer handed her a cup of water. Clean water, cold and clear. She hesitated, certain it was a trick. He smiled faintly and said, "You look thirsty, ma'am." The word ma'am hit her harder than the Atlantic wind. No German officer had ever spoken to her like that. Then came the next blow, the camp itself. The barracks were wooden but solid, lined with clean bunks. A Red Cross truck sat by the gate. There was a canteen, a small library, even a nurse's tent stocked, organized, ready. It wasn't paradise. It was something harder to understand. Respect. That night, Helga lay awake listening to the chirp of crickets and the sound of guards talking softly by a campfire. They weren't monsters. They were boys, young, tired, human. One strummed a guitar. Another laughed about his horse back home. She rolled onto her side, whispering to herself in German, "It's an illusion. It must be." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't. There was no hatred in the way they moved, no anger in their eyes. A few days later, a camp doctor checked her wounds. He worked gently, saying only, "You'll heal fast." She couldn't meet his eyes. In Germany, she'd seen prisoners beaten for less. Every day chipped away at what she had believed. Every gesture contradicted her training. The barbaric Americans didn't exist. Only ordinary men doing an extraordinary thing, treating the enemy as human. Still, Helga refused to let herself soften. She wrote in her diary, "They show kindness to conquer the mind. I must not fall for it." But deep down she could already feel the ground shifting. She wasn't fighting an army anymore. She was fighting her own disbelief. The moment the cowboy had unshackled her wrists still burned in her thoughts. She didn't understand him, but she couldn't forget him either. If this was America, she thought, then everything she'd been told about the world was wrong. And in the days to come, that realization would spread through the camp like wildfire, not through orders or speeches, but through the quiet, relentless power of decency. By 1944, the United States held more than 400,000 Axis prisoners of war in over 500 camps across 46 states. Texas alone hosted nearly 80,000, more than any other state in the country. The camps were scattered across ranchland and farmland, from the pine woods of the east to the dry plains of the west. To the Germans, it was disorienting. They had expected cages and cruelty. Instead, they found fences, order, and discipline that didn't come from fear. The camp where Helga Voss arrived near Hereford was one of the few in the nation built to accommodate women, auxiliary staff, nurses, and clerks who had served behind the lines. The Americans didn't quite know what to do with them. The guards were young men from Texas and Oklahoma, most of them farmers, ranchers, or mechanics before the war. They had never seen enemy women before, let alone been told to guard them. The camp was simple but efficient. Rows of wooden barracks, a mess hall, an infirmary, and an open field where laundry lines fluttered in the wind. Barbed wire surrounded it all, but beyond the fence lay miles of ranch land dotted with mesquite trees and cattle. To Helga, it looked less like a prison and more like a strange, inverted village. The guards were polite but firm. Meals arrived on time. The American flag flew high above the entrance, not as a threat, but as a statement of order. Every morning, the prisoners lined up for roll call, then walked to work assignments, sewing uniforms, tending vegetable gardens, washing laundry for nearby army bases. In the distance, she could hear the engines of trucks and sometimes even laughter from the guard side of the fence. One afternoon, an officer explained through an interpreter that the camp operated under the Geneva Convention. "You will be treated with dignity," he said. "You will be fed and housed. You will not be harmed unless you try to escape." Helga didn't believe him, but the consistency of it, the structure, the calm professionalism wore at her skepticism. The Americans followed rules not because they feared punishment, but because the rules mattered to them. Letters from other camps began to circulate quietly among the women. One from a soldier held in Oklahoma read, "They feed us more than we had at home. They call us Sir. They say we are their guests until Germany is sane again." The women laughed bitterly when they first read it, but inside it hurt. It was impossible to ignore the reality before their eyes. At night, as the cicadas hummed outside, Helga wrote in her diary, "These people have built a prison that feels freer than the world we left behind." But beneath the calm surface, something else was brewing. Rumors whispered through the camp about a cowboy guard who had broken orders on arrival day, who had taken off a woman's shackles in front of everyone. Some said he'd been punished. Others said even the officers had saluted him. Helga didn't speak of it, but she knew the story was true. She still felt the phantom touch of freedom around her wrists. The Americans had built a system of control so fair it disarmed even its captives. But soon the numbers behind that fairness, the cost, the scale, the moral weight, would reveal just how powerful mercy could be when applied with machinery-like precision. For months, Helga Voss had watched the same ritual unfold with mechanical precision. Meals at dawn and dusk, guards rotating every 4 hours, supplies arriving by truck from towns whose names she could barely pronounce. Everything ran like a factory. Efficient, unrelenting, predictable. But what astonished her most wasn't the order, it was the waste. Each morning, American cooks served the prisoners bacon, bread, beans, and coffee. Coffee. Real coffee. In Germany, her patients had fainted from hunger in makeshift hospitals. She had sewn wounds while her stomach ached for days. And now, across an ocean of graves, her captors offered breakfast like it was nothing. One afternoon, she overheard 2 American guards talking by the fence. "Government spends a fortune feeding these folks," one said, shaking his head. "Heard Washington's paying more for POWs than for our own boys." The other guard nodded. $2 a day per prisoner. That's a lot of eggs. Helga didn't understand every word, but the meaning was clear enough. Later, an interpreter confirmed it. The United States spent nearly $2 a day feeding every Axis prisoner, even during wartime shortages. She could hardly believe it. That was more than most German civilians earned in a week. She sat on her bunk that evening doing the arithmetic in her notebook. Hundreds of prisoners, dozens of camps, millions of dollars, all for people the Americans had every reason to hate. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense unless mercy itself was part of their strategy. The scale of it staggered her. Across the country, American factories had switched from cars to tanks, tractors to bombers. And now those same industrial arteries were feeding their enemies. Over 400,000 Axis POWs, Germans, Italians, even Japanese, were housed in a system so vast it rivaled the infrastructure of entire nations. They were building not just machines but morality, mass-produced decency at a national scale. The Germans had built war around fear. The Americans built it around faith. Faith that order, law, and fairness could conquer hate faster than bullets. Weeks later, a new group of prisoners arrived, skeletal and weak from transport. Helga watched as American medics rushed to help them. One guard handed a prisoner his canteen, whispering, "You'll be all right now." The man began to cry before the water even reached his lips. That night, Helga couldn't sleep. She wrote a single line in her journal. "They spend more to feed us than we ever spent to keep ourselves alive. How can that be weakness?" The next morning she saw the cowboy guard again. Caleb Stone, the one who had unshackled her months earlier. He tipped his hat as she passed. She nodded back, though she still couldn't bring herself to speak. As he walked away, she realized something that chilled her more than fear ever had. The Americans weren't just defeating Germany's army, they were dismantling its ideology, meal by meal, gesture by gesture, until even the most hardened believer began to question everything they'd been told. And for the first time, she began to wonder if decency, not firepower, was the true secret weapon of this strange and terrifyingly humane enemy. Spring 1945 came early to Texas. The wind smelled of cedar and dust. The sun burned gold through the fences, and even the cattle seemed lazier than usual. To Helga Voss, every sunrise in captivity still felt like a negotiation with reality, a contest between memory and mercy. One morning, the guards led the women out of the barracks for work detail at a nearby ranch. They were to help mend fences and sort feed, tasks that required no weapons, just hands and time. But that day something different happened. When they reached the corral, a cowboy guard, the same one from her arrival, Caleb Stone, was waiting with 2 horses. He gave her a half smile. "You ever ridden before?" Helga blinked, unsure she'd understood. "Ridden?" He pointed at the chestnut mare beside him. "Figure she could use a gentle hand. You look like you got one." The women standing nearby froze. None of them moved. None dared breathe. A German prisoner, a woman being asked to mount an American horse. It was absurd. It was impossible. Caleb stepped forward and said, "No shackles today." The phrase rolled through the group like thunder. One by one, the women looked at each other. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted to be the first to challenge him. Finally, Helga placed a trembling hand on the mare's neck. The horse didn't flinch. She whispered, "We heist, see?" "What is her name?" "Daisy," Caleb said softly. "You'll like her. She don't judge nobody." The crowd fell completely silent as he helped her into the saddle. For a moment, even the flags above the camp seemed still. She sat upright, unsure what to do, the sunlight hitting her face. Her eyes darted between the barbed wire, the guards, and the open field beyond. Caleb nodded toward the horizon. "Go ahead, just a walk. She knows her way." Helga guided Daisy in a slow circle. The motion was awkward at first, stiff, unnatural, but then her body remembered what it meant to move freely, without orders, without bars. Her breath caught. The horse's steady rhythm filled the air, and then something broke inside her. Tears slipped down her face before she even knew she was crying, not for Germany, not for defeat, but for the sheer absurdity of kindness in a place built for war. When she finished her loop and dismounted, the other women didn't speak. They didn't have to. For the first time, they'd all seen something stronger than victory. Forgiveness. Caleb tipped his hat again. "You did fine, ma'am." That night, no one in the camp could sleep. The story of the ride spread like wildfire from bunk to bunk, whispered like a secret prayer. Some wept, some laughed, some stared at the ceiling trying to understand why freedom felt heavier than chains. In her journal, Helga wrote, "He gave me a horse, and I forgot to hate him. What kind of power is that?" By dawn, the camp was different. The guards stood a little taller. The prisoners spoke a little softer. For one extraordinary afternoon, the war had stopped at the fence, and in that stillness, Helga realized that the line between captor and captive had blurred, replaced by something dangerous and magnificent. Respect. For weeks after the ride, the camp operated under an invisible truce, not signed, not spoken, but felt. Guards and prisoners moved through the days with a quiet rhythm, each aware that something irreversible had happened. The memory of Helga's ride lingered in every corner like sunlight that refused to fade. But for Helga Voss, the real reckoning came later, not in the saddle, but in silence. She had spent years believing in a world built on superiority. The strong rule, the weak obey. The Reich had trained her to see mercy as weakness, kindness as corruption. Yet here in the middle of Texas, surrounded by cowboys and barbed wire, that entire philosophy had fallen apart. Every morning the Americans proved her wrong again. The guards treated them fairly, spoke to them with civility, and never once laid a hand in anger. When a woman fell ill, the camp medic, a freckled kid no older than 20, brought soup and aspirin from his own ration kit. One evening, as Helga helped wash utensils after dinner, she overheard the guards joking about budgets. "You know," one said, "Washington spending $1.8 billion on these camps." The number barely registered until the second guard added, "That's more than Germany spends feeding its own army." Helga froze, a fork clutched in her hand. $1.8 billion. The sum was so vast it sounded like fiction, and yet it was true. The Americans were pouring money, labor, and food into a humane captivity system for their enemies. She sat awake late that night, staring at the figure she had scribbled on a scrap of paper. Each dollar, each loaf of bread, each gallon of gasoline spent on keeping prisoners alive instead of starving them. It was a kind of moral arithmetic she couldn't solve. Her entire life had been defined by scarcity, by the logic of cruelty. Take or be taken. Here the equation inverted. The Americans were winning because they gave more than they destroyed. The next morning she saw Caleb Stone again at the fence. He greeted her with his usual easy smile. "Morning, Miss Helga. How's the world treating you today?" She wanted to say something sharp, something to reassert the wall between them, but no words came. All she managed was a quiet nod. Later, when she returned to her bunk, she opened her journal and wrote, "They defeated us without a single insult, just food." It was not poetry. It was confession. Over the following weeks, that realization spread like wildfire among the women. Their pride had been broken, not by force, but by decency. They began to talk less about home, less about their former leaders, and more about what they would do after. One prisoner whispered to another, "If this is defeat, maybe defeat is not the end." It was an unthinkable thought, and yet It felt like truth. By the time summer came, the air itself seemed lighter in the camp. The guards relaxed, the women smiled more often, and when work parties left for the ranches, some even waved. The war in Europe was collapsing, but in this unlikely patch of Texas, the collapse had already happened quietly, humanely, and completely. For Helga, it wasn't surrender, it was transformation. And deep down she knew this would haunt her far longer than any victory speech from Berlin. By late spring, the US Army allowed the German prisoners to send letters home. It was part of the Geneva Convention. The Americans said each envelope was stamped, censor examined, to remind them that every word would be read before it crossed the ocean. Still, for the women in Camp Hearn, Texas, those letters became a fragile lifeline to a homeland that no longer felt real. Helga Voss sat at a rough wooden table, pen trembling between her fingers. The camp provided stationery, a fountain pen, even a dictionary for those who wanted to write in English. Around her, the other women whispered as they wrote to husbands, brothers, children they might never see again. She began simply, "My dearest sister, Anna, I am alive, and I am safe." Then she stopped, staring at the words, safe. The word itself felt foreign. She tried to remember the last time she had written it honestly. She continued, "The camp is strange, not cruel, as we were told. The guards are firm, but not unkind. We work in the fields, and sometimes the cowboys let us help with the horses. I even rode one once. Her name was Daisy. I still cannot believe it happened." Her pen hesitated again. How could she describe it without betraying everything she'd believed, without sounding like a traitor? She wrote carefully, "They treat us better than our leaders ever did. I do not know what to make of that." Around her, others wrote similar words. Some were defiant, others cautious. A few, trembling with emotion, dared to tell the truth in full, that the Americans had shown them more dignity in defeat than their own leaders had in triumph. When the camp censor, a young army sergeant from Kansas, read the letters, he paused. "You folks sure are polite for people who think we're the enemy," he joked. But those words, carried across oceans and through ruins, became something far more powerful than jokes. They spread through post-war Germany like whispers from another world. In Stuttgart, Anna Voss would one day read her sister's letter aloud to a neighbor. "They feed them?" she asked in disbelief. "They let them ride horses?" And another voice would say, "Maybe the Americans aren't monsters after all." From Texas to Bavaria, the truth traveled farther than any bullet, quietly, patiently, reshaping what an entire nation thought it knew about its enemy. For Helga, the act of writing itself became liberation. Each line she sent home was a thread cut from the fabric of fear, each envelope a tiny rebellion against the lies. Her final paragraph read, "I cannot explain it, Anna. They fight us fiercely in battle, but here they fight for our souls with kindness. I am beginning to wonder which is stronger." When she sealed the envelope, she felt lighter, not because she had been forgiven, but because she had told the truth. That night, she looked through the fence at the fading sunset and whispered, "Maybe someday the world will believe us." She didn't know it yet, but her letter, one among thousands, would help lay the quiet groundwork for reconciliation between two nations. It was never printed in a book. It never made the news. But in 1,000 kitchens and parlors across a broken Germany, women like Anna read those words and wept, not for loss, but for the possibility of mercy. Weeks passed. The Texas summer rolled in like a furnace, thick with heat and cicadas. Work hours grew shorter, the war news grimmer. The women didn't know much, only rumors from guards or new Red Cross bulletins. But they sensed something in the air, something ending. Helga Voss spent her mornings helping mend fences and clean tools. The Americans no longer bothered with shackles or constant surveillance. They didn't need to. The women worked because it gave their hands something to do, their minds something to hold on to. One afternoon, a familiar truck pulled up to the camp gate. Caleb Stone stepped out, hat low, boots dusty from miles of ranch trail. He wasn't on duty. This time he came by choice. He walked to the fence and called out, "Got a delivery for Miss Helga." The guards looked puzzled. So did she. She approached slowly, wary of another surprise. Caleb lifted a small glass jar through the wire. Inside was a deep red jelly that shimmered in the light. Homemade, he said. Peach preserves. My ma canned them before Christmas. Helga stared at it as if it were a relic. For me? She whispered. He nodded. Figured it's about time you all tasted Texas the way it's meant to be. The moment hung between them. There was no transaction, no explanation, just a gift, small, absurd, and impossibly human. She took it with trembling hands. Why? Caleb rubbed his neck, glancing at the sky. War's nearly over. You folks will be going home soon enough. Thought maybe you could remember something better than barbed wire. Behind her, the other women gathered, watching silently. Not one of them spoke. They didn't know whether to feel gratitude or shame. Helga wanted to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she reached through the fence, offering her hand. For a moment the cowboy hesitated. Then he took it. A strong, warm, calloused grip, the kind of handshake that made enemies irrelevant. To anyone watching, it was nothing, a simple gesture. But for those who had lived through years of hate and orders and lies, it was everything. That handshake was an act of rebellion against the world that made them enemies. Later that night, the women gathered around the jar in the barracks. They opened it carefully, as if afraid to ruin something sacred. The scent of peaches filled the room, sweet, foreign, and painfully gentle. Each woman took a small spoonful, silent, reverent. Some cried, some laughed through the tears. One whispered, "I haven't tasted fruit since 1941, Helga wrote in her journal. Today, a man gave me a jar of peaches. I used to believe our empire was built on greatness, but his kindness built something stronger." Outside, Caleb drove away under the setting sun, unaware that he had just written himself into the memory of his former enemies. In the years to come, Helga would say that the war ended for her not on May 8th, 1945, but that day when the cowboy handed her the jar, because that was the day she realized freedom wasn't just the absence of chains, it was the presence of grace. The war ended officially on May 8th, 1945. The radios in the camp crackled with the news. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. Some prisoners cried. Others stared blankly at the dirt. But Helga Voss didn't cry. She only sat still, her hand resting on the jar of peach preserves that had long since been emptied. For days the camp was filled with a strange silence. Not grief, not joy, but exhaustion. The guards didn't gloat. The prisoners didn't protest. Everyone seemed suspended between worlds, unsure what came next. In that quiet, something profound happened. The line between captor and captive blurred, and all that remained was a shared understanding of what war had taken from them. Helga began to notice small things. The guards helping pack trunks for the women returning home, the cook setting aside extra bread for their journey, the cowboys tipping their hats as they passed. None of it was required. All of it was real. She wrote one final entry in her journal that week. They called them cowboys. We called them fools. But it turns out the fools were us. It wasn't bitterness. It was revelation. For months she had believed that the Reich had failed only because of resources, not righteousness. But now looking at these Americans, their strange mixture of strength and softness, she understood they hadn't just won the war with machines. They'd won it with mercy. The barbecue, the peaches, the horses. These things weren't luxuries. They were lessons. Every small kindness had chipped away at the empire of fear she'd carried inside her, and in that crumbling, she found something terrifyingly beautiful: humility. When the time came to leave, the trucks rolled up under the same Texas sun that had once burned the air with dust. The women lined up quietly, carrying their few belongings. Some wore clothes patched by American hands. Others carried small gifts, letters, trinkets, or a worn pair of gloves from a guard who'd once been their warden. Caleb Stone stood near the gate as Helga climbed aboard the truck. Their eyes met one last time. Neither spoke, but both understood that something irreversible had happened, not just to them, but to the world they represented. As the truck rumbled away, she looked back through the bars. The camp shrank in the distance, a blur of fences and sunlight. She whispered, "We lost the war, but maybe not our souls." Years later, in post-war Germany, Helga became a teacher. When her students asked what America was really like, she would smile faintly and say, They didn't need to teach us with guns. They taught us with grace. The decency that had once been an act of defiance became legend among the POWs who survived. Some would speak of it in interviews, others only in whispers, but all of them agreed. That time in Texas changed them more than any battle ever could. For the Cowboys, it was just another summer, another job. For the prisoners, it was the beginning of forgiveness, the moment they learned that compassion could rebuild faster than bullets could destroy. And for history, it was proof that even in war, the smallest human gesture could echo louder than a victory parade. Because when the enemy becomes the teacher, war no longer wins. In the end, all that remained of Camp Hearn was wind, grass, and memory. The barbed wire rusted away, the barracks crumbled, and the Cowboys went back to their fields. But the story of that summer, of dignity extended between enemies, never truly faded. For Helga, Voss, and the women who left Texas, the lesson followed them home. That dignity could exist even between captor and captive, that strength didn't always roar from a gun barrel, and that mercy, quiet, stubborn mercy, could outlast any ideology. They had mocked the Cowboys once, yet it was those same Cowboys who showed them what civilization really meant. Not conquest, but kindness. Not dominance, but decency. They mocked the Cowboy. The narrator concludes, he treated them with respect instead. Because history may remember who won the war, but it is compassion that wins what comes after, and somewhere in the vast Texas plains, the ghosts of that unlikely mercy still linger. German prisoners and American ranchers, united not by politics, but by something far rarer, humanity.